Alison Stewart-Allen, who looks at these things from a branding point of view and from the point of view of how our company looks. Did the Murdochs do what they needed to do to put a bit of shine back on the company or not?
I think, Richard, if you look at all of the comments that they made over the course of the past 3 hours, what comes out loud and clear to me are two executives who appear profoundly out of touch. Some of the statements that we heard earlier, I made lots of notes, as you can imagine. All news organizations use private investigators as if that legitimizes the practice. No, I'm not responsible for the fiasco. I trusted people. Well, excuse me, the chief executive of a company is responsible. So Mr. Murdoch's, both Messieurs Murdoch, need to own what has happened in their organization. The culture is clearly broken. And there are so many other comments like that.
Right, so let's go round you all. We'll stay with you, Alison. But briefly, do you think now that Rebecca Brooks's task is much more difficult? She's been hung out to dry by that very statement at the end of Rupert Murdoch. Those responsible, I knew not what was happening, he says, but there were those who were responsible.
It's one of the things that's interesting about this situation, Richard, is if you think about Miss Brooks's history, she is born and bred within the stable of News International. So in terms of propagating a culture that is abiding by these codes of ethics that we've heard countless times over the course of the last few hours, there are processes, there are codes of conduct, there are rules, but actually, where has the enforcement actually been made to make sure that those rules are abided by senior leaders in this business? And from what I've heard today, I can't actually say that the company is showing evidence of that.
Jeffrey, let me turn to you briefly. For our viewers in the United States, on the 9/11 question, Murdoch quite clear about nothing happened, but James Murdoch far more equivocating on that. I don't have any information about that. We're looking into that. Do you think that what they said about 9/11 victims will be pacified today?
No, not at all, because their strategy today, Rupert Murdoch's strategy, was to say, I saw no evil, I heard no evil, everyone lied to me, I was kept in the dark, this is just 1% of my vast corporation, I'm not responsible. Everyone else is responsible, I'm not. So the question becomes live. Did Glenn Mulcair, who hacked into the relatives' phones of their sons killed in Afghanistan, killed in terrorist operations, it would seem to make sense that at this time, logically, he might well have hacked in to the 9/11 relatives, or at least the British relatives of 9/11, to get a grief story, not a public interest story, but a grief story. Now, the stance that Rupert Murdoch took, and this was the most important thing, as I've said, they've admitted to paying Glenn Mulcair, and they may still be paying him, the man who did this. They've got to look at their contract with Mr. Mulcair. He's the man who could say yes or no that he did or did not hack into the phones of 9/11 victims, and he's the man who the Murdochs themselves, when confronted briefly and in the one shaft of light in this hearing, said, well,
Jeffrey,
maybe we're still paying him, maybe he's still on contract. Ask him, let him go public, let him tell the world and tell America immediately whether he did that dreadful thing, no more dreadful than the other things that he did do, of hacking into 9/11 as well as to other parents of terrorist victims. Let the Murdochs put him on the stand now.
Jeffrey, we'll pause there. Okay, I hear what you say. We'll pause there just for one moment and say to our viewers in the United States, thank you for joining us in London for the evidence of Rupert Murdoch and his son James Murdoch, and obviously there'll be much more on CNN USA in the hours ahead. As we continue around the world, Michael Cockrell, you know, we're going to hear from Rebecca Brooks very shortly in the next 5 minutes. Has she been dumped on from a height by Rupert and James, do you think, today?
Well, there was a certain implication there in what Rupert Murdoch said in his last words. I mean, there's been an extraordinary disconnect going on for the last 2.5 hours in terms of what we know of journalism, what we know of tabloid journalism, and all this rather corporate speak that was going on. Rebecca Brooks knows more than anyone. She knows where the bodies are buried. She was editor of the News of the World when Andy Coulson was her deputy. She then became editor of The Sun. She then became the chief executive of News International. So she knows how journalism works. And there was no sense, really, in this hearing today of the way journalism works on the front line, how it works as far as the editor is concerned, what the editor really knows of what her staff or his staff is up to. Those kind of questions will need to be asked to Rebecca Brooks, but she may say that because she has been arrested, because there's a police investigation, ongoing criminal investigation, she can't answer them as fully as she would like.
Pull the strands together before we hear Miss Brooks, starting with you, Alison. At what point do you think this crisis takes a different turn? Because the judicial inquiry is many months, and it'll be a couple of years, I suspect, before we get any findings from it. The police inquiry, similarly, could take a very long period of time. Has this been the moment? Has this been the denouement, if you like, the Murdochs before the Select Committee?
I'm not so sure, Richard. I think that there's still many more weeks to run with this, because it's so monumental in terms of the scale, the scope of what's happened, and it appears not necessarily contained in just one newspaper. And by retiring the News of the World brand doesn't necessarily mean that the infection has been contained. My suspicion is that the infection is actually much wider spread. It may even be beyond the News International and News Corporation family, and it perhaps is an industry-wide practice. So one hopes that on the back of what we've heard today, that maybe some deeper questions will be asked about industry practices rather than specific to any one company.
Alison, stay with us along with Jeffrey and Michael. This is CNN's continuing coverage